Some losses refuse to stay in the past. A young American soldier dies during the Second World War, his death recorded, dated, and filed. Yet for decades afterward, he remains listed among the missing. This is the case of Private Harland J. Hennessey, a U.S. Army engineer who died in captivity in the Philippines in 1942. There was no grave in his hometown, no body returned. Only a name carved into stone and a family left with paperwork instead of certainty. His story moves through official notices, mass graves, and long stretches of waiting, shaped as much by what was done as by what could not be finished. At the center of it sits a single designation, Common Grave 704, linking death, delay, and a return that came more than 80 years too late. Harland J. Hennessey woke before the alarm, as he usually did. The room at 155 Ford Street was still dark, the kind of Adirondack dawn that lingered, undecided. He sat on the edge of the bed, with his feet on the cold floorboards, listening to the house breathe. The kitchen clock down the hall marked time with a steady tick. Somewhere below, his mother moved softly, already awake, already arranging the morning into something manageable. He reached for his boots first. That was always the first thing. Not the shirt folded over the chair, not the wallet on the dresser, but the boots. He lifted one, turned it over, checked the sole with his thumb like he was inspecting equipment at work. Satisfied, he set it back down and picked up the rag from the nightstand. The rag was stained with old grease. Oil darkened into the fabric, and he wiped his hands carefully even though they were clean. It was a habit left over from the gas station, from years of making sure nothing slick stayed on his skin. Clean hands meant control. It meant you hadn't missed something. He had been running every morning for weeks. Down Ford Street, past the quiet houses, out toward the edge of town where the road dipped and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. He ran the same route each time, counting his breaths without meaning to, feeling his legs settle into the rhythm. It felt like work, not training. Something you did because it needed doing. When he came back, his shirt would be damp at the collar, the cold air biting his lungs just enough to remind him he was alive and moving forward. On the dresser sat his wallet. Inside it, tucked behind his draft card, was a small, creased photograph. The house on Ford Street. His parents standing stiffly on the steps. Donald half turned toward the camera, already impatient even then. Harland took the photo out sometimes, not to look at it for long, just to make sure it was still there. He slid it back into place and snapped the wallet shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Downstairs, Dorothy Hennessey folded a dish towel and hung it over the stove handle. She had already written her grocery list on a scrap of paper, torn from the edge of an old envelope. Milk, flour, coffee. She pinned it beside the stove with the same thumbtack she used every week. Routine kept the house upright. If she followed the same steps, nothing could fall too far out of place. She heard Harland's boots on the stairs and turned without looking. "You're up early," she said, even though that was no longer unusual. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, careful not to spill. He always stood, never sat, like he was waiting for a whistle that hadn't blown yet. She set a lunch pail on the table, already packed, sandwich wrapped tight. An apple polished on her apron. She slid it toward him. "Army food can't be worse than this," she said, trying for light. He smiled, just enough. "I'll survive," he said. "I always do." She reached for his shirt collar and smoothed it, then caught herself and dropped her hand. Instead, she picked up a loose button near the cuff and threaded her needle without comment. He pretended not to notice, staring out the window while she worked, the needle flashing in the early light. "Don't fuss," he said quietly. "I'll write when I land. 1 to 1. Everyone." She nodded, eyes on the button. "Just come back in one piece." They didn't say more than that. They never did. Questions stayed folded away like letters not yet written. Donald came down late, hair sticking up, still chewing as he pulled on his jacket. He cracked a bad joke about Harland finally learning to take orders, and Harland laughed despite himself, the sound brief and easy. For a moment, it felt like any other morning. For a moment, the leaving hadn't happened yet. After breakfast, Harland went back upstairs and polished his boots until the leather shone. He lined his gear up on the bed and checked it piece by piece, moving with care: shirt, socks, papers. He folded everything the same way, squared the edges, then wiped his hands again with the rag. His mother watched from the doorway, saying nothing, memorizing the way he moved through the room. Before he left, she stood in the hall holding an empty envelope. She had bought it days earlier, tucked it into the drawer by the stove. Just in case. She turned it over in her hands now, feeling the weight of something that wasn't there yet. "I'll be back before the snow settles," he said, pulling on his coat. She nodded, as if that settled it. When the door closed behind him, the house went still. Dorothy folded his laundry later that afternoon, then stopped halfway through and sat down, realizing she didn't have to anymore. She left his room exactly as it was. She told herself she would keep it that way. She told herself that meant something. Harland treated, leaving like a job site. He checked in. He followed instructions. At Fort J, then Fort Belvoir, he learned how to handle equipment heavier than anything he'd known before. Bulldozers, trucks, steel plates. He liked the order of it, the way things fit together when you followed the plan. He wiped his hands clean after every task, the rag always tucked into his pocket. At night, he lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to other men talk about home. He didn't talk much. He kept the photo in his wallet, sliding it out sometimes under the blanket, tracing the edge of the house with his thumb. He didn't say what he was afraid of. He didn't say that the idea of being trapped somewhere, unable to move, sat heavy in his chest. When the orders came for overseas deployment, he packed without complaint. On the ship, he stood at the rail and watched the coastline disappear, the water endless and gray. "Tell your mother I'll write as soon as we dock," he said to a man beside him, already knowing he probably wouldn't. In the Philippines, the heat settled on him like a weight. Clark Field smelled of dust and fuel, metal baking in the sun. He ran when he could, early in the morning, before the air turned thick. He wiped his hands constantly, sweat streaking the rag. He worked the runways, filling holes, laying surfaces, moving like he always had, steady, practical, focused on the next task. He kept the photo in his pocket. It creased more with each day. When the bombing started, there was no time to think about home. Just noise and smoke and orders shouted over engines. He moved because the man beside him moved. He filled craters while planes burned. He shared a canteen cap of water with Sergeant Frank Red Malloy after a long shift, both of them pretending it was enough. Hennessey didn't complain, Malloy would say later. "That's what scared me." Harland never said he was afraid. He never said he wondered if the promise he'd made could still hold. He just kept moving, wiping his hands, checking his gear. Like if he did everything right, the job would end and he'd go home. Back in Boonville, Dorothy checked the mail every afternoon. She pinned the grocery lists. She kept the room the same. The envelope stayed empty. And somewhere between the routines he trusted and the promises he made, Harland stepped into a future he didn't know would never quite let him arrive. The engineers stopped building long before they stopped being called engineers. En Baton, the word followed them like a habit that no longer fit the work. Harland J. Hennessey still carried tools at first, still thought in terms of surfaces and angles, but the jungle did not care what he had been trained to do. The ground was soft and slick, the air heavy enough to press against the chest. Every movement took effort. Every pause felt dangerous. They were hungry before they admitted it. Meals shrank quietly, then all at once. Rice watered down until it slid through the fingers. Cans divided among too many men. Harland learned to chew slowly, to make the act of eating last. He wiped his hands before and after, the rag darker now, stiff with salt. At night, he lay awake listening to the sound of men coughing, the jungle breathing back at them. Sergeant Frank Red Malloy counted steps when the fear crept in. He had started doing it during the first bombardment, pacing out distances that no longer mattered. 1, 2, 3, 4. It kept his mind from racing ahead. He kept his fiancée's ring knotted into the toe of his sock. Pockets couldn't be trusted. Nothing could be trusted. Harland worked beside him, quiet, efficient. They repaired what they could, then tore it apart when orders came to deny it to the enemy. Destroying your own work did something to a man. It left a hollow place. Harland never said so. But Malloy noticed how carefully he handled the charges, how long he looked at the twisted metal afterward. "Soon as this is over," Malloy said one night, lying on the ground with the dirt pressed into his cheek. "I'm sleeping in a bed for a week." Harland let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. "I just want a floor that doesn't move," he said. When the lines collapsed, it happened quickly and slowly at the same time. Orders came down the road, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth. Destroy equipment, fall back, move. Harland carried what he could, until there was nothing left worth carrying. When the surrender came, it did not feel like an end. It felt like being told to stop without being told what happened next. The Japanese tanks appeared on the road like something inevitable. Harland stood with his hands empty, the rag tucked into his pocket, the photo pressed flat against his thigh. The first soldiers they encountered barely looked at them. Later ones did. Malloy remembered the sound of boots, the way the air seemed to tighten. They were gathered in groups too large to count easily. Names lost their usefulness. Harland stayed close to Malloy at first, the two of them moving when pushed, stopping when shouted at. Someone struck Harland across the shoulders with a rifle butt when he stumbled. He caught himself, wiped his hands without thinking. The march began, under a sun that did not move. The road shimmered. Dust stuck to sweat, turned skin into something gritty and foreign. Men fell. Some tried to help them up and were beaten for it. Malloy counted steps until the numbers blurred. 1, 2, 3. He lost track and started again. Water became a rumor. Harland took a capful when it came, handed half of it back to Malloy. "Don't," Malloy said. Harland shrugged. "We'll need each other later." Later was a word that kept changing shape. The sound of gunshots came from behind sometimes. Malloy learned not to turn his head. He focused on Harland's back, on the way his shoulders moved. As long as that rhythm stayed steady, Malloy told himself, they were still moving forward. By the time they reached the trains, Harland's boots were worn thin. The boxcars were dark and hot, packed beyond reason. Men pressed together, breath stolen by bodies. Harland stood with his arm braced against the wall, holding Malloy upright when his knees buckled. Sweat dripped from his hair, stung his eyes. He wiped his hands on the rag, then wiped Malloy's face when he could. At Camp O'Donnell, death became routine. Bodies carried out in the morning. Names crossed off lists that few men ever saw. Harland survived by narrowing his world. Eat when there was food. Drink when there was water. Move when told. He did not talk about home. The photo stayed hidden now, too precious to risk. When they were moved again, to Cabanatuan, it felt like a transfer between versions of the same place. Bamboo barracks, earth floors, the smell of sickness thick in the air. The latrines overflowed when it rained, turning the ground into a sucking mud. Men lay on bamboo slats, staring at the ceiling, waiting for their turn to be carried out. Malloy kept his notebook hidden, names written small, careful. He added Harland's name after each day, as if to prove he was still there. He shared a canteen cap of water with him after a long work detail, both men pretending it was enough. Hennessey didn't complain, Malloy whispered once, voice barely there. "That's what scares me." Harland looked at him, eyes sunken, face thinner now. "Complaining doesn't move the day," he said. Disease moved faster than time. Legs swelled, bellies distended. Pain shot through limbs without warning. Men were sent to the zero ward and did not come back. Harland worked until he couldn't. He sat when ordered to stand. He lay down when told to move. The date was written down later. November 1st, 1942. Clean ink, no description of the hour, no note of who was there. Malloy was on a work detail that day, hauling something he could not remember. When he came back, Harland's place on the slat was empty. He asked around quietly. No one had seen the end. Someone said the zero ward. Someone else shook their head. Malloy opened his notebook and stared at the name, his hand hovering. He wrote the date beside it, then closed the book. The burial detail moved at dusk. Malloy watched from a distance as bodies were lifted, thin as bundles of sticks. Harland's face was turned away. Or maybe Malloy couldn't bring himself to look. The pit was already open, the earth heavy and dark. Men were lowered together. There was no space for sorting, no markers that would last. Before the dirt fell, someone searched pockets. Habit, orders. Dog tags were gone long before. Clothing taken when it could be used again. Letters, if there were any, disappeared without ceremony. Malloy did not know who took what. He only knew that when the earth closed, something essential went with it. He promised himself he would tell Harland's family what happened. He rehearsed the words in his head. We were together. He was strong. He did not suffer long. None of it felt true enough to say out loud. After the war, Malloy stood in a borrowed suit and tried to speak to strangers who shared his uniform once. He opened the notebook and read names like a prayer. When he reached Harland's, his voice caught. I don't know how to tell this, he said finally. And that was the closest he came. Harland's identity moved on without him. A record here, a roster there. Common grave 704, a grouping, not a person. The date stayed clean, the rest blurred. Back home, Dorothy Hennessey received a telegram delivered by a man she did not know. She stood in the doorway holding the paper, reading the words again and again. Died. Philippines. The house felt too quiet. She folded the paper and put it in a drawer with the empty envelope. She waited anyway, because without a body, without a place to stand, waiting was the only thing left to do. And somewhere between the road at Bataan and the earth at Cabanatuan, Harland J, Hennessey passed from being a man others spoke to, into a name others tried to remember. His story thinning with every hand it passed through, until all that remained was a date, a grave number, and the weight of not knowing who had been there when he was last alive. When the war ended, it did not end evenly. Some families received coffins, flags, dates that could be circled on calendars. Others received paper that said everything and explained nothing. Harland J. Hennessey belonged to the second group, declared dead but not returned, accounted for but not found. The machinery of closure stalled just far enough short to leave a permanent gap. In 1947, that machinery tried once more. The American Graves Registration Service arrived at the former Cabanatuan camp with clipboards, cameras, and a mandate to restore order to chaos. The war was over. The dead were supposed to be processed. The ground held hundreds of men, many buried together, some with records, many without. The work moved forward grave by grave, number by number. Common grave 704 was open like the others. The soil was heavy, compacted by time and rain. Inside were remains that no longer belonged to individuals in any obvious way. Bones overlapped. Positions suggested haste, exhaustion, necessity. The analysts did what they could with the tools of the era. Measurements, visual assessments, dental charts. If teeth remained intact enough to read them. 2 men from that grave were identified. Their names were removed from the group. The rest stayed behind. Harland J. Hennessey was one of the 8 who could not be separated from the others with certainty. There was no dramatic declaration, no moment of failure that anyone marked. A line was drawn through his name on one list and written onto another. Unidentifiable, unknown. The remains were reassigned, reburied, their location fixed, but their identity suspended. In Manila, the American cemetery grew into a place of order and symmetry. White crosses, clean paths. For the unknowns, markers bore only codes. An X number. A system that acknowledged presence without recognition. Harland's physical remains rested there, though no one knew which marker held him. His name, meanwhile, was carved into the walls of the missing. A monument for those whose bodies were never recovered or never named. Back in Boonville, Dorothy Hennessey stood at her kitchen table with the letter in her hands. It said her son was dead. It said nothing about where he was. She read it once. Then again. She folded it carefully and placed it with the earlier telegram. 2 confirmations. Still nothing to bury. She did not cry right away. She made supper. She set 2 places before catching herself and removing one. That night, she folded Harland's shirts and placed them back in his drawer. The next morning, she pinned her grocery list beside the stove. Milk, bread, coffee. Routine was the only thing that did not argue back. Years passed in this suspended state. Dorothy aged into her grief without ever moving through it. She told people her son had died in the war, then paused, as if waiting for a question that never came. She kept his room intact longer than anyone thought reasonable. Dusting became an act of care. Touching his things was the closest she came to touching him. The family learned to live around the missing space. Donald built a life of his own. Children arrived. One of them was named after Harland. A decision that carried more weight than explanation. "You were named after him," they said, as if that answered everything. In 1945, the local veterans of foreign wars post voted to take Harland's name. The decision passed without argument. He was a hometown boy. He had not come back. The post sign went up bearing his name, and for decades afterward, men gathered beneath it to drink coffee, argue politics, and remember things they did not always say out loud. The name became familiar, spoken weekly, then daily. It kept him present. It also froze him in place. Dorothy died without seeing her son returned. Howard followed years later. They were buried in the Boonville cemetery, a family plot with one space left deliberately open beside them. The headstone did not include Harland's dates, just his name, waiting. For John Hennessey, growing up meant inheriting that waiting. He knew his uncle through photographs, stories told carefully, and the unspoken rule that some questions went unanswered. Harland existed as a reference point, not a memory. He was always here, John would say later, and never here. The reserve plot became part of the landscape of his childhood, something you passed without touching. By the time John was an old man, the war felt impossibly distant. But the paperwork did not age the same way. At the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, files from earlier conflicts remained active, waiting for someone to reopen them. Advances in forensic science made old conclusions feel provisional rather than final. The Cabanatuan project began quietly, driven by a simple premise, that the unknowns buried at Manila could be traced back to specific common graves, and from there to specific groups of men who died on the same dates. History, reassembled through lists. Dr. Elena Park joined the effort without fanfare. She was used to working cases where the families were already gone, where identification meant correcting a record more than healing a wound. Group cases made her uneasy. Too many points of failure. Too many families attached to the same set of bones. She had a habit of tapping her pencil 3 times before opening a file. It felt like knocking. When she first saw the list associated with Common Grave 704, she stopped tapping. The names clustered around a single date. November 1st, 1942, different units, same end. The unknowns, believed to originate from that grave, were disinterred in 2018. The process was careful, documented, slow. The remains were flown to Hawaii, logged into a system designed to prevent the kind of loss that had followed them for decades. Evidence bags were labeled in careful handwriting, often late at night when the lab was quiet. "Every bone is a person." Park kept the laminated tag clipped to her gloves. It was not a slogan, it was a warning. Anthropological analysis came first. Age ranges. Stature estimates. Biological sex. Each result narrowed the field, but never enough to feel safe. Dental analysis followed, charts from the 1940s compared to surviving teeth. Some candidates were excluded. Others stayed stubbornly possible. Harland J. Hennessey remained on the list. There were no children to provide DNA. That pushed the case sideways, into the maternal line. Genealogists traced the family forward, then outward. Calls were made, letters sent. Some relatives declined, polite but firm. The war was long ago. The cost felt too high. John Hennessey did not hesitate. He wrote the DPAA phone number on an index card and placed it beside his kitchen phone. He read the local obituaries every morning with his coffee, as he always had. The day of the appointment, he mowed the lawn, trimmed the edges carefully. He wanted to arrive steady. At the clinic, the swab was quick. The waiting afterward was not. Months passed. Park checked the database more often than she admitted to anyone. When the mitochondrial DNA result appeared, matching the maternal line with high confidence, she did not allow herself relief. She started over. Every other candidate from the grave. Every possible source of error. The fear of misidentification pressed heavier than the desire to finish. Only when every alternative had been exhausted did she allow the case to move forward. The final step was not scientific. It was administrative. Forms signed. Status changed. Words updated in a system that had once lost him. On September 23, 2024, Private Harland J. Hennessey was officially accounted for. The call reached John on a quiet morning. He listened without interrupting, his hand resting on the table where his grandmother once folded letters that never came. Identified. After all this time, the words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. At the Manila American Cemetery, a rosette was placed beside Harland's name on the wall of the missing. A small marker, easy to miss unless you were looking closely. It signaled that the waiting, at least on paper, was over. For the first time since 1942, Harland's story moved forward instead of circling. But the movement carried risk. Answers had arrived too late for the people who needed them most. What remained now was not the question of whether he could be found, but what finding him would ask of the living who were still here to receive him. The phone rang on an ordinary morning, the kind that did not announce itself as different from any other. John Hennessey was standing at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside him, when he saw the number on the screen. He let it ring once, then answered, his free hand resting flat on the wood, where his grandmother had once rolled dough, her movements steady and practiced. He listened. The words came carefully, professionally, identified, accounted for. After all these years, John did not interrupt. He did not sit down right away. He stayed standing, weight shifting from one foot to the other, as if balance mattered. When he finally spoke, he asked the same question twice, not because he hadn't heard, but because hearing felt dangerous. Saying it out loud might break something. When the call ended, the kitchen felt strangely hollow. The radio murmured on, a voice talking about weather that did not matter. John turned it off. He sat down slowly, hands folded, staring at the place on the counter where the phone had been. For most of his life, Harland had been a story that never changed. Identification did not complete it. It unsettled it. He drove to the cemetery that afternoon without thinking it through. The road was familiar, the turns automatic. The gravel crunched under his tires as he pulled in. He walked to the family plot, past headstones he had known since childhood, and stopped beside the space between Howard and Dorothy Hennessey. The grass was trimmed short. The earth was level. Waiting, John knelt and pressed his palm into the ground. It was cool, firm. "We found him," he said quietly. The words felt both true and insufficient. He stayed there longer than he planned, the sound of wind moving through the trees, filling the space where conversation might have gone. At the Manila American Cemetery, far from Boonville, a small rosette was placed beside Harland's name on the wall of the missing. It was a modest act, easy to miss among the marble and symmetry. For decades, the wall had held Harland in a category of waiting. Now, his name shifted. The wall remained full. Thousands of others stayed exactly as they were. When John saw the photograph of the rosette later, it struck him how quiet the change looked. No ceremony, no crowd. Just a symbol that said the system had finally caught up with one man. Back home, the news traveled carefully at first, passed in phone calls, then carried further. People reacted with surprise, with approval, with a kind of reverence that came from distance. The VFW post bearing Harland's name became a place of gathering without planning to be. Men who had met there for years found themselves speaking differently, as if the building itself had shifted. VFW Commander Jonathan Vieno stood beneath the sign and listened more than he spoke. He understood what the return meant and what it did not. "It's our namesake coming home," he said finally. "It's emotional." The room stayed quiet after that. No one tried to fill the space. Preparation replaced waiting. Forms arrived. Signatures were required. John learned quickly how many documents followed a single identification. He was listed now as next of kin. The title surprised him each time he saw it. He had grown up in Harland's shadow, but he had never expected to stand in this position. At night, John went through boxes he had ignored for years. Photographs slid from envelopes. Letters written in Dorothy's careful hand appeared between old books. Grocery lists on scraps of paper. Notes pinned and repinned. He found the empty envelope she had kept, folded neatly, despite its age. He held it carefully, the paper thin and fragile, and wondered how many times she had taken it out, then put it back, waiting for something to arrive that never did. Dorothy Hennessey was not there to hear the news, but she was everywhere in the days that followed. In the way John folded the papers. In the way he paused before making decisions, hearing her voice in his head. Her grief had never been loud. It had been precise, methodical. Identification did not erase that. It gave it a place to rest. The army notified the family formally. Dates were set. August. John marked the calendar, then found himself staring at the space around the date more than the number itself. He thought of Dorothy marking time the same way, circling nothing, waiting for letters that did not come. When the plane landed in New York, the air smelled of fuel and summer heat. The honor guard stood ready on the tarmac, uniforms pressed, movements exact. John watched as the flag-draped casket was transferred, each step deliberate, each hand placement practiced. The sound of boots against concrete echoed sharply. The weight of the moment pressed down in a way he had not anticipated. This was not symbolic. This was physical, final. The drive from the airport to Boonville moved slowly. Along the route, people stood by the roadside holding flags. Some were veterans. Some were children who had learned the name only days earlier. Others stood quietly, hands at their sides, unsure what to do but unwilling to look away. The line of witness stretched farther than John expected. Inside the vehicle, John clasped his hands together and watched the flags pass. He thought of Dorothy standing at the window when the mail truck came, even years after hope should have faded. He thought of Harland's promise about snow settling, how specific it had been, how fragile. At the cemetery, the grass had been freshly cut. The smell hung in the air, sharp and clean. Chairs were arranged in rows. People gathered quietly, some familiar, some not. The New York Army National Guard took position with practiced ease. Commands were spoken clearly. The service unfolded without excess. The rifle volleys cracked through the air, each report distinct. Taps followed, the notes thin and carrying, settling into the open space. John stood still, hands clenched, feeling the sound move through him rather than around him. The flag was folded with care, each crease precise. When it was placed into John's hands, he felt its weight fully for the first time. The fabric was stiff, the folds exact, proof and burden, together. He nodded, unable to find words that would not collapse under their own meaning. Harland was lowered into the ground beside his parents. The space that had been held open for decades finally closed. The earth fell softly, guided by hands that understood the importance of doing it right. John watched until it was finished, his gaze fixed on the place where waiting had finally ended. This was not reunion. It was alignment. A family restored to the shape it should have taken long ago. Afterward, people gathered at the VFW post. The hall smelled of coffee, food, old wood. Photographs were laid out on tables. Music from another era played quietly. Conversations overlapped. Stories passed between people who had not known Harland but felt connected to him anyway. John stood beneath a sign bearing Harland's name and listened. He realized that the story now belonged to him, whether he wanted it or not. He was the last bridge between a young man who left Boonville in uniform and a town that had carried his name without his body for 80 years. Relief did not erase grief. It sharpened it. The happiness people expected him to feel came tangled with the knowledge of who was missing from the crowd. Dorothy, Howard, the men who had voted to name the post. Closure, if that was the word, arrived unevenly. Late in the evening, when the hall thinned and voices softened, John stepped outside. The air had cooled. Crickets sounded from the edges of the lot. He held the folded flag again, tracing the seams with his fingers. Somewhere, a case file had been closed. Somewhere else, another had been opened. Harland J. Hennessey was home, and the truth of that settled slowly, unevenly, into the lives of those left to carry it. The return did not arrive as a single moment. It came in stages, each one measured, deliberate, careful not to rush what had already waited for more than 8 decades. Harland J. Hennessey came home the same way he had left Boonville all those years ago, not loudly, not ceremonially at first, but carried by systems, by routines, by people trained to move with restraint. The aircraft touched down in New York under a pale summer sky. Heat rose from the tarmac, carrying the smell of fuel and metal. The honor guard stood in formation, uniforms pressed, faces neutral. When the cargo door opened, there was no announcement, just movement. White gloves reached forward. The flag-draped casket emerged slowly, guided hand by hand, as if any sudden motion might undo the weight of what it carried. John Hennessey stood a short distance away. He had seen photographs of flag transfers before, but standing there, he understood the difference immediately. This was not symbolic. This had mass. This occupied space. The casket was lowered with precision, aligned exactly. The flag smooth so that no corner fell out of place. The sound of boots against concrete echoed briefly, then stopped. Silence followed, intentional and held. John felt his throat tighten. He did not cry. He noticed instead the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the way his shoulders pulled inward. This was the first moment when Harland's return felt undeniably real. Not a name corrected in a database. Not a rosette on a wall. A body. A weight that had traveled farther than anyone who loved him had lived. The drive north toward Boonville unfolded slowly. The hearse led the procession, followed by vehicles that joined quietly, one by one. As they passed through small towns, people were already waiting along the road. Some held American flags, the fabric snapping softly in the breeze. Others stood bareheaded, hands at their sides. Teenagers paused mid-stride. Older men straightened, without thinking. No one waved. No one spoke. They simply stood and watched. John sat inside the car behind the hearse, looking out through the glass as the world passed. The roads were familiar, the curves and tree lines unchanged. He imagined Harland driving these same routes before the war, wiping his hands on a ragged stoplights, thinking about work, about supper, about nothing that hinted at where he would end. He imagined Dorothy standing at the window decades later, picturing this same drive, without knowing its shape, only its absence. In Boonville, the cemetery waited. The grass had been cut short, the scent sharp and green in the August air. Chairs were arranged in even rows, spaced carefully. Headstones caught the sunlight in dull flashes. People arrived quietly, greeting one another with nods instead of words. Veterans found one another instinctively, standing shoulder to shoulder, without being told. John walked ahead to the family plot. Howard and Dorothy Hennessey's headstones stood as they always had, weathered but steady. Between them lay the open space that had waited for decades. The earth was fresh, darker than the surrounding ground. John placed his hand on Dorothy's stone and felt its coolness. He left his palm there longer than necessary, grounding himself in the physical fact of it. The New York Army National Guard moved into position with practiced ease. Commands were given softly but clearly. The service began. Names were spoken, dates acknowledged. The words were formal, restrained, carrying the weight of repetition rather than flourish. Harland J. Hennessey, United States Army, World War II. When the rifle volleys cracked through the air, the sound startled despite expectation. 3 sharp reports, each one echoing briefly, before dissolving into the trees. John felt the vibrations in his chest, and 14-2, and 4-2 bowling. Then came taps, the notes thin and clear, floating outward across the cemetery. The melody felt fragile, almost breakable, yet it held. John stood still, his hands clenched in front of him. He did not look away. He did not move. The sound settled into him, not as sadness alone, but as something older. A recognition that this moment had been delayed so long, it carried more than one generation's weight. The flag was folded slowly, deliberately. Each movement exact, rehearsed until it no longer looked rehearsed at all. When it was placed into John's hands, he felt its stiffness, the firmness of the folds, the fabric pressed into his palms, heavier than he expected. He nodded once. His mouth opened, then closed again. No words arrived that could hold. Harland was lowered into the ground beside his parents. The space that had been held open through decades of uncertainty finally closed. Soil fell in careful shovels. The sound soft, almost respectful. John watched until the shape of the earth changed permanently, until waiting gave way to final placement. Around him, the town stood quietly. Some people wiped their eyes, others stared straight ahead. Children shifted their weight, sensing importance without fully understanding it. A few older men removed their caps and held them against their chests, eyes fixed on the ground. After the burial, the crowd moved together toward the VFW post. The building had carried Harland's name for nearly 80 years without his body. Now, it received him fully. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, food, and old wood. Photographs were arranged on tables. Some showed Harland as a young man, smiling stiffly at the camera. Others showed Dorothy and Howard, long gone. Music from the war years played softly, familiar but distant. John stood beneath the sign bearing his uncle's name and listened. Stories surfaced in fragments. A man remembered hearing about Harland from his father. Another recalled Dorothy sitting quietly during meetings, never speaking much, but never missing one. The room did not buzz with celebration. It held a low, steady murmur, as if everyone understood this was not a moment to rush past. Dr. Elena Park stood near the edge of the room, observing without drawing attention. Few people recognized her. Fewer still understood her role. She watched John move from group to group, the folded flag never far from his reach. She thought of the lab in Hawaii, of boxes still waiting, of names still unresolved. She felt no pride, only a quiet acknowledgement that one part of the work had reached its end. As the evening wore on, conversation slowed. People began to leave, carrying pieces of the day with them. The town, for the first time in generations, no longer carried Harland as a question. It carried him as a presence that had returned too late to be lived with, but not too late to be placed. John stepped outside as the light faded. The air had cooled. Crickets sounded from the edges of the lot. He stood alone for a moment. The sounds from inside the post muffled behind him. He looked up at the darkening sky and thought of all the years Harland had been missing, not only from the ground, but from moments, suppers, holidays, ordinary days that had passed without him. No burial could restore those years. No identification could undo the waiting that had shaped a family and a town. But something essential had changed. There was now a place to stand without imagining. A plot of earth that held truth instead of possibility. A name that no longer waited on a wall. As John turned to leave, he glanced back once more at the sign reading Harland J. Hennessey, VFW Post. For 80 years, it had marked a promise without fulfillment. Now, it marked a return that carried relief and residue in equal measure. What remained was not closure. What remained were the consequences of waiting and the quiet responsibility of remembering a man who, at last, had somewhere to rest. Harland J. Hennessey's story ends neatly on paper. A date corrected, a status changed, a grave filled. The system finally closes its loop, satisfied that what was lost has been found. But the human accounting never balances the same way. For more than 80 years, his absence did work. It shaped a mother's routines, a town's rituals, a family's silences. Dorothy Hennessey waited without a place to stand, carrying grief that could not settle because it had nowhere to go. John Hennessey grew up beside a reserved plot of earth, learning early that some stories are inherited to unfinished. A veteran's post bore a name without a body, turning memory into duty long before return was imaginable. Identification did not rewind any of that. It did not restore the years Harland missed or the moments when his absence mattered most. It changed something quieter and more dangerous. It forced the waiting to stop. Waiting can be active. It gives shape to hope. Ending it requires something else entirely. At the Manila American Cemetery, thousands of names remain carved into stone, unchanged. Harland's rosette does not erase them. It sits among them like a question turned inside out. Proof that time can be crossed. Evidence that most crossings never happen. Dr. Elena Park closes one file and opens another. John places flowers beside 3 headstones instead of 2. Boonville exhales, carrying forward a story that no longer lacks an ending. Only time. The final date, August 23, 2025, lands softly, like a hammer wrapped in cloth. Harland returned to a world that had already learned how to live without him. That is the last contradiction his story leaves behind. He was found. He was buried. And the echo of his absence remains no longer in the ground, but in the decades that stretch between loss and return, where so many others are still waiting to be called home.